Good morning, good afternoon, good evening everyone, wherever you are on this beautiful planet. I hope that everything's going to plan for you, and that you're not experiencing obstacles on your spiritual journey, and also that you're not too traumatized by the recent events in the world that are causing many to feel despair and hopelessness. Just remember, there is always hope as long as we remain compassionate and loving towards others and never lose our intention to make the world a better place. And as a Buddhist, then, the way we do that is to first look in the mirror and improve our own situation, and through our own development and spiritual progress, then we are able to benefit others. Could someone just tell me if you can hear me all right in the chat? Strange. Okay, good. Hello everyone, I can see your chat now. Okay, so I've been getting complaints from people saying I'm going too slow. I should speed up, get the lead out of your butt, Lama, someone said. So I'll try to answer some questions more quickly. Okay, you can hear me, great. So just at first then, just kind of firm up your resolve to be a better person and to make progress. Ultimately, if you are a Buddhist and Mahayana Buddhist, then what you want to do is you want to become Buddha for the sake of all beings, but also you might just want to escape the madness of the mundane world and seek liberation. Those are all valid reasons for practice. And you know what? Also practicing in order to gain better rebirths in future lifetimes is also valid, as I mentioned in a previous video. So last week we came to the end of the hour. We were running late, so I kind of got halfway through this question about is Buddhist practice compatible with atheism and agnosticism. Well, Buddhism is basically an atheistic religion, similar to Taoism is also atheistic in some ways, although they do talk about lots of kind of cosmic gods and things like that, who are influential, let's say, but not creator gods. In terms of agnosticism, then there is generally two different ways of thinking about agnosticism. There are those who basically believe that there is no way to understand the ultimate truth or to know the mind of God, for example. So the term agnostic is a negation on the term gnostic, which means knowledge or knowing. So it's not able to know. Also, it often refers to skepticism, so being skeptical. But I think for many people, an agnostic is someone who wants more evidence, so they haven't made their mind up. So the Buddha said that you should investigate, and so in those terms then agnosticism is compatible with Buddhism. But in terms of just merely being skeptical or believing that there is no way to know the ultimate truth, then that is not compatible with Buddhism, because we believe that you can realize the ultimate truth. So it's until you've realized the ultimate truth, and at that point you become a noble being, then it's not something that is knowable by ordinary beings. So ordinary beings can't have knowledge of the ultimate. Also cannot, I suppose it's the same as the comment that you can't directly interact with God. You need some agency. For example, there's the triangle of the God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus. And so these are kind of similar to what we have in the Buddha Dharma when we talk about the three kayas, because it is said that you can't directly know the Dharmakaya unless you're a Buddha. But the point here is that in Buddhism we believe that ordinary beings can become Buddhas, they can become arhats, and therefore there is a pathway to this knowledge. And most theistic religions, then that is only the domain of the Supreme Being, and we're kind of like inferior, and we just basically have to have faith and belief and do what we're told. without any hope of ever becoming ourselves what would be the equivalent of God. So fundamentally, Buddhism is atheistic and partially agnostic in terms of wanting to have evidence, not just accepting the word of doctrine, but we're not skeptics. We're curious. Right? We're ones who investigate. We look for the answers. So in general, when we talk about knowledge in the Buddha Dharma, there are three types of knowledge. There is that knowledge of that which is overt, discreetly observable, that all sort of beings have. Humans are more intelligent than animals, but in general we have this knowledge of what is discrete. There is the knowledge of what is hidden, and this is basically things that only can be known through inference. And so those people who are slightly more intelligent or who investigate through philosophy, logic, metaphor, these sorts of things, think about the nature of reality, theoretical scientists, then they have the second type of knowledge, to be able to see those things which are hidden from us. And then there's what is called knowledge of what is extremely hidden. And this is something that only noble beings can understand. And for example, when it comes to the inner workings of interdependence and karma, cause and effect, then it's only a Buddha or a Tathagata that has access to this. For example, a Buddha can understand all the various interdependent connections that come about to cause any phenomena. And they see all of those. The way it's described in scriptures is that the Buddha knows every cause and effect that led to the eye on the tail feather of a peacock. So all phenomena, if we just think about the Big Bang, have come about because of this incomprehensible succession of events that led to this present moment or something coming to arise. And only Buddhas are party to that. But a human being, for example, can think, okay, there's this lens cap, and it was made in a factory in Mexico or China, and then there were workers, and so there are many hundreds of thousands of people involved in this process. Originally, it was sort of oil that was drilled out of the earth, etc. So people who are able to infer that knowledge, that isn't ultimately hidden knowledge. That is just hidden knowledge that we can infer or logically understand. So in terms of the Buddha Dharma, then, we seek this knowledge, and we also seek ultimate knowledge through liberation or realization, let's say. And that was the question from Miss Slayer from America. We go on to the next question, which is Grisha from Russia. Hello, Russia, Grisha. I don't know if you're actually watching, and sorry for taking so long to getting to your question. We have this question is martial arts practice conflicting with the Dharma practice? Could a competitive combat athlete also progress on studying Dharma? Absolutely, a competitive combat athlete could practice the Dharma path. In terms of the Eightfold Noble Path, then there is something called right livelihood. Being a competitive sports athlete, even if that's boxing, isn't necessarily, it's violent, right? But it's not necessarily kind of wrong livelihood, especially for a lay person. It wouldn't be appropriate for a monk or a nun, although they do this, right? But if we look at the broader picture, then it's mostly associated with the Zen tradition, the Chinese Zen tradition. We've got the very famous Shaolin monks. And the Shaolin monks were something that is attributed to a figure called Bodhidharma. So Bodhidharma famously introduced Zen Buddhism to China around the 5th century. This is the typical picture we see of Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma was said to be a blue-eyed barbarian. So can you still hear me? Are you still able to hear me? I've changed over. Hopefully you are. So famously, it's taught that this Persian or guy from southern India, possibly, it's not clear, then he traveled to China and he brought Buddhism with him, and he established the Zen tradition, which is called Chan in Chinese. And he was hardcore, and he taught the monks discipline of combat arts. And so this is where we get this tradition, but it's only really exists in China, and it has to do with the culture. There's a really strong martial culture in China, and historically as well, it's the same in Japan and Korea and China, that at some point then Buddhism came into the country, and it was repressed by the government because it tended to be the religion of the people, right? Peasants, right? Buddhism taught that wealth wasn't good, and usually, especially in the earlier stages of Buddhism, said a lot of negative things about kings, etc. And so then what happened was that the people started to become repressed, and so the kind of Buddhists took up arms. And so there was, for example, the Emperor of China kind of conquered, or was very influential in Korea, was having wars with Japan, and they instituted these laws where you weren't allowed to have any weapons. So the kind of police or the military would go around, and if anybody had weapons, they would be sort of incarcerated or even killed. And so the peasants developed these techniques in order to fight using ordinary tools like threshing tools and things used in the farms. And this is actually associated mostly with these Buddhist communities. Now, the problem is because when Buddhism came to China, it got mixed up with Taoism. Now, somebody's asked a question about Taoism, so I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it got mixed up, and so basically it's all the kind of poor, common people. They became Buddhists because Buddhism was anti-caste, right? It said that it didn't matter if you were a king or a peasant, doesn't matter if you're a Brahmin or if you were an untouchable. What matters is your level of training. That's what the Buddha taught. Whether you're a man or woman is not important. It's all down to your spiritual training. And the people who have higher levels of training should get more respect. Well, of course, kings don't like this sort of stuff, right? But the peasants liked it because it gave them a sort of avenue, an avenue out of their oppression. And so they developed all these martial forms, and it's especially in China because it was this repressive kind of imperial government that was all pervasive, you know. It had swayed great domain over people, and they oppressed like minorities, etc. And it's said that this kind of history eventually led to these Boxer revolutions. There was these sort of wars between the white and red armies in ancient China. And it was said to be the Buddhists fighting back. I mean, historians don't all agree. Excuse me. So we've got this very strong martial tradition. And in Japan, then the monks basically became employed by the emperor. And they taught the samurai, etc., mind control and all these sorts of things. So they were, So they were highly integrated into this martial system. So it's kind of common to East Asia, China, Korea, Japan. There's less of this in Korea. They're far more non-violent. It was really quite extreme in Japan. As I said, the monks used to train the samurai. And also in China, we've got this Shaolin tradition. But it doesn't really exist anywhere else in Buddhism. It's a kind of Chinese thing. For example, the Tibetan monks don't engage in any kind of martial training whatsoever. They have had to defend their monasteries in the past. When the Chinese invaded, many monks took up arms, but they were just completely slaughtered and wiped out. They're not very good fighters. And they don't see this to be a good thing. They see it to be a negative thing. Now, in recent times, you will have seen the Drukpa Kagyu. They look like us, but they wear little hats. It's like a little chapeau or something, red hat. It's not the red hat like the Karmapa fancy one. They're like little bonnets, I guess you call them. And in recent times, they've been teaching the nuns. There's a group of nuns. I think there's lots of videos on YouTube how to do martial arts. But the martial arts they're teaching them are basically Japanese martial arts. It's not anything at all associated with Tibetan Buddhism. And like I say, in Tibetan Buddhism, then the monks should be non-violent. I'd have to say that the Tibetans are a little bit more aggressive, maybe, than the sort of Sri Lankans and the Burmese, because they come from a very tough country. But in general, they wouldn't get into this kind of arguments. My own teacher had said before that sometimes he'd get people causing trouble and they'd say, well, if you weren't a monk, I'd punch you in the nose or something like that. But it really isn't in our monastery, we don't have this mentality. There is a really funny story, though. I'm sorry it's going to take up more time, but I have to share it with you. Because in general, when we come to a new place, for example, the Tibetans had to run away from China, and then from Tibet, because the Chinese had invaded, and they came to India and Nepal. And of course, initially the locals would always be a bit suspicious about foreigners coming in, other people coming in, and they're Hindus, and they didn't like Tibetans coming in, building monasteries everywhere. And so the locals of our monastery, Namo Buddha, back in the day, right, years and years ago, then they were quite against the monastery having so much kind of land and doing so much development and growing in their communities. And so this almost always happens, that the locals kind of rebel a little bit. And so the young there's a lot of gangs in Nepal. The young people get into gangs. That's a really strong culture. And so they were like coming to the monastery and trying to threaten the monks with, I think they said they had like golf clubs, like iron golf clubs. And they would come and threaten them and try to extort money out of them. So the monks in our monastery learned Kungfu. In fact, they learned it's Wu Tai, this pentagram, we call it, type of martial art. And they did it to kind of scare off the local hoods, they're all young boys. And eventually, when they saw the monks were doing Kung Fu, then the locals got a bit shy and they didn't bother them anymore. The other thing was that the driver, Ram, he's an amazing guy, he's a Nepali guy. He's just, everybody calls him Uncle. And he used to be a gang member, like a serious gang member, and he was a nutcase, and everybody was afraid of him. But he started working for the monastery, and became like a driver for the lamas and stuff like that. And when Ram, this guy, joined the monastery, everybody's like, "Oh, better be careful, Ram's crazy." He's such a sweet guy, though, but he has a really big reputation in Nepal for being like a complete crazy badass gangster. But they don't do any martial arts at all anymore. That was just then. Usually what happens is the monastery comes into India or Nepal, into a little village. All the Hindus think, what is all this stuff? Who are these foreigners? Immigrants, right? And they really kind of rebel against them. And then once the monastery starts developing, what happens is the whole area starts becoming rich. Like there's really good, you could say karma maybe, where it creates good economies. But everywhere, if you look at Sherbling, in India, Tai Situ Rinpoche's monastery, when they first went there, the whole area was just poor hill farmers, just really dirt poor. They built the monastery. The locals were like, who are these Tibetans coming in here? They rebelled against them or whatever. And then after the years, as the monastery grew, now these guys who live around the monastery are the richest farmers in the area. And it happens everywhere they go. So now they're really friendly. And our monastery in Nepal, then what's happened is that the locals now come to the monastery to learn Tibetan and to practice the Dharma. You see them all coming together, like all these lay people, like they're Hindus, right? And they're learning Tibetan and they're learning Dharma, and they're really, really friendly with the monastery now. So there's no need. And this is really why in China we ended up with this martial monasteries, because they had to defend themselves. And the problem was, it was by royal decree that they were being oppressed. It wasn't just the locals getting annoyed with them. It was the king was like saying, you tax them, beat them up. And so they had to learn to defend themselves. And that's really why this tradition happened. But Bodhidharma is a bit of a nutcase. Because like people say, oh, Zen tradition, there's no effort, there's no meditation, you don't have to do anything. That's what all the Westerners say. Look at Bodhidharma's life story. He sat in a cave and he stared at the wall for like 10 years. And then he got distracted and he was so upset with himself that he cut his eyelids off, right? That doesn't sound like no effort, right? So you have to kind of get into context. I mean, it sounds like they say it's like, realization is spontaneously arising, etc. But the truth of the matter is that the Zen practitioners are really, really diligent. And they apply themselves crazy, like they sit in Zazen for 12 years, without any instructions. And then the master will go, okay, this guy looks like he's getting somewhere, I'll give him a koan, right? But in the West, we sort of think like, yeah, it's all spontaneous. You don't need to do anything, just chill out. The Zen monks are not chilled out. The Shaolin monks are not chilled out. So, and also, of course, having this martial training helps them to develop their diligence. These days, they don't have to go around fighting, right? And it's not like monks never fight. I mean, in Southeast Asia, sometimes the monasteries get into trouble. But it really depends on who's coming to the monasteries. As kind of society changes, different types of people come to the monasteries. And in the past, it was very different, right? So in general, though, they're very passive. The main conduct is non-violence. And so, like in the Gelugpa monasteries, then they're very, very, very peaceful. And they don't, they couldn't defend themselves. They don't almost get no exercise. And they're totally susceptible to other people's oppression and violence. Just look at what happened in northern India, in the Gangetic Plains, at Nalanda and Vikramasila, the two huge monasteries. They were colleges with thousands of monks. When the Turkic horseback kind of Islamic troops came into India at that time and took everything over, when they came to these huge monasteries with thousands of monks, they just went in and slaughtered everyone. They killed every last monk in like a day. There was just blood running in the streets. And the monks had no weapons and they had no way of defending themselves. They were totally passive. So it was by need, really, that this martial system evolved. But now it's a form of developing diligence and discipline. So like I said, there is a Tibetan tradition called the Drukpa Kagyu, and they've introduced martial arts into what they're doing. But the reason isn't very good. The reason is to raise some money. It's because like people think, wow, that's cool. And it develops interest in what they're doing, and then they can get more donations. And also the other reason is because they themselves have got no tradition of study, so they don't really know what they're doing. So they're putting all their energy into non-Buddhist things. And that's going to offend some people, but this is what my teacher teaches. Okay, somebody asks, it's Maitreya loves you from Saskatchewan. Oh wow, okay. So Saskatchewan is the province next to where I was born. It's basically flat and filled with wheat fields. And in winter, the sky and the ground become one. Everything's just white. And it's freezing cold, like -50. So you need stuff to do in Saskatchewan. They're our brother province. I'm just picking on them. Okay. In this sudden shift in awakening, I'm constantly being shown how many awakened warriors are in the world. What is your perspective on intuitive fighters, sword saints? So this is a similar topic. And I would also like to hear your subjective opinion on the Maitreya Buddha. Also, what is a bodhisattva? Okay, so a bodhisattva really is what we call this hero of the Dharma. And, you see pictures, especially in the Zen temples on the doors, there's a picture of a crazy looking naked guy with a sword. Actually, that's like their representation of Vajrapani. Vajrapani is the Buddha of power, and he doesn't appear like that. In the Tibetan tradition, what you'll see is an orange Buddha called a Manjushri Gosha, and Manjushri Gosha has a sword. That sword actually symbolizes wisdom. It doesn't symbolize like martial swords and things like that. It's cutting through ignorance. But the Vajrapanis that you see on the Zen temples are kind of to ward away evil spirits. It's a bit strange because in China then different traditions got merged. So Vajrapani, that is actually a manifestation of the Buddha, kind of got demoted to like a protector of the door kind of thing. But this idea of Vajrapana being the Buddha of power isn't about fighting power. But again, the sword saints is very much a Chinese thing. It's not really Buddhist. It's kind of like Buddhism came to China and it got mixed up with all their own tradition. And then it ended up with this iteration. So the better practitioners, then they will have a kind of good impression on this. For example, in the Zen tradition, all this sword control and everything is a way of developing mindfulness. You can use anything as a way of developing your mindfulness and your meditative power. And so training in archery, training in sword fighting, music, whatever you want, can be very productive. And we kind of like that in the West. But usually what happens is it just causes us to get led astray or to distract ourselves, because all we do is we take the thing we already like, right? And then we try to make it into spiritual practice because we don't want to give up on that. So what you need is wisdom. Again, Manjushri Gosha holds a sword. The sword is a sword of wisdom. It cuts through ignorance. That's the real meaning. But in general, the authentic monasteries and things, and the monks, they sit around studying and meditating all the time. They don't practice martial arts. And I'd have to say that I would never go to a Shaolin monk to get instructions on meditation. I doubt they even know how to meditate. They basically spend all their time doing physical training. And that sounds probably quite pejorative, but it's not. In China, they used to have a great tradition in Buddhism, and it was destroyed, right, by the government. They banned all religion and they closed all the temples, right? And they killed the monks or forced them to become soldiers and things like that. So they completely lost their tradition, and they had very deep and strong traditions and a lot of learning in China. They used to be so learned, but that you can barely find anybody there who knows anything about the Dharma. So all they have is these cultural aspects, and they spend all their time on that. In fact, the Shaolin monks, and really predominant in southern China, if these monks want to teach or to do anything in the Buddha Dharma, then usually what they do is they go to Taiwan to study for a few years, and then they come back because they have no means, right? And the government's not interested in the Buddhist view. In fact, if you're going to survive as a religious institution in mainland China, then the first thing is you have to accept the CCP's kind of manifesto, their view, which says that communism is more important than Buddhism. And it's the same. So it's only those religions that accept the CCP manifesto are allowed to officially be recognized. And so they're not really interested. It's just a way of, the way they use the temples in China is to raise money to pay for the upkeep of the temple. So you even get government workers who dress up like monks, and then they go to the monastery and they look all kind of holy, and then people give money at the temple because the Chinese love doing that. It's their tradition, right? If you look, whenever they have like a religious ceremony, there's these fake dollar bills and things. So it's all about money. They collect the money. It's a kind of idiot tax, but it is good because it helps to keep the monasteries looking nice. And if you go, but it's cynical, because for the government, the reason for doing this is that these temples look amazing, right? They're preserved. Some of them are 700 years old. And so if there's money there to support them, then you've got a good tourist site and it attracts tourism. So for the government, it's just cynical. There are people who are quite serious, in China. That's very difficult for them. In general, the way they see it in China is that when you're retired, then it's okay to go to the temple, but otherwise you need to work and study for the motherland kind of thing. And for example, they're trying to destroy this tradition in Tibet. They're forcing the young kids to go to school and learn Chinese, forget about Tibetan, and learn like engineering, whatever, probably just get education so they can work and work in factories. And then when they're retired, this is actually in the government statements, right? Religion is for old men and women kind of thing. Then they send them to the monasteries when they're old, and then they dress up like monks. And it's quite a difficult situation. So like I say, these Shaolin temples, they don't have any system of education. And they don't really know how to meditate or anything like that. They're probably quite mindful. They got good mind control because they spend all their time, like it's a bit like that Kungfu movie where they've got like a pot of roasting coals and you hold it in your arms. So it's like that. That's their Buddhism. It's like super diligence and mind control. That's not really what it's about. So a bodhisattva is a hero of the awakening mind. So they courageously never lose their compassion and love for anybody, even their enemy. That really is the meaning. I asked my own teacher when I was in retreat, Akon Rinpoche, I said, what is a bodhisattva? Because I consider him to be a bodhisattva. He said, accept everything. Soft mind, warm heart. That's what a bodhisattva is. So true. The important one is accept everything. That means even if somebody stabs you, defames you to the entire world, then you only hold them with the greatest respect and love. That's what a bodhisattva is. Bodhisattva is not like somebody who says, oh, in these Chinese movies, the monks all have one hand in prayer position, and then they've got a weapon in the other, and they're like, if you approach me, I will defeat you. That's not a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is like, oh, please come cut my head off. If you need it, take my head. I don't need it. You have it. It's completely opposite, right? Okay, finished with that one. Jane from California says, what is the meaning of samsara and nirvana are not two? Could it mean that our conceptual thinking causes us to live our world in duality? Relatively. So this is a huge topic. And she's also put this into context of the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible, which is quite a profound connection. There's a lot can be said, and so people are going to get annoyed because I'm going to spend some time on this question. So we have this notion of the world and heaven, or samsara and nirvana, right? Suffering and peace and tranquility. Now, the way you relate to those is going to be directly in the context of your own natural view. But you have to understand in the Buddha Dharma there's something called the two truths. This is associated with the second turning of the wheel of Dharma and Zen Buddhism. And that is the truth of this kind of existence and non-existence. So there are these two extremes. And it sounds very much like the presentation in Taoism, right? The yin and the yang. We see that to be very, very similar. There are very significant differences in this view. So essentially we've got method, wisdom. We've got the provisional, we've got the ultimate. We've got appearance and emptiness. We've got samsara and nirvana. These are two ways that we mistakenly conceptualize the world. Now, in the foundational level of view, the foundational vehicles of Buddhism, Theravada, for example, the elders, then their goal is to seek personal liberation, is to transcend samsara, which is the mundane world, and achieve a state of nirvana, which is what we kind of talk about as heaven, right? The term samsara means a wheel, right? And we can think about this like a machine, right? This is the method side. This is the conventional reality. This is provisional reality. But many people think about it like here on earth is the world, it's mundane, and we want to escape from that. And then we achieve nirvana. And in the West, we think of that as being heaven. Really, nirvana, nibbana, means snuffing out. It's what you do when you put a candle out. And it means just to stop this relentless cycle of rebirth into suffering. And that's what they do in the Theravadan tradition, is they become arhats. So they don't even become Buddhas. They just do whatever they can to get out of samsara as soon as possible, to end this relentless cycle of suffering. Now, the relentless cycle of suffering doesn't mean you don't have temporary happiness. Right? It doesn't mean that you're 24/7 being burnt alive by hot coals. It means that whatever you do, if you're at the top of the wheel, eventually you'll be at the bottom. It just goes around and around and around and around. It's pointless. And so the mendicant, the monk, right, recognizes, the person who wants to become a monk recognizes, wow, this is just a waste of time. I can't have this anymore. That's called renunciation. And then they apply themselves to the Eightfold Noble Path. And by that, then they slowly progress towards nirvana, which is a snuffing out of self. They remove all clinging to self. They realize selflessness of the individual. And by that, they achieve this snuffing out, which is a state of peace and tranquility, which is no longer subject to this mechanical wheel of samsara. That's one presentation. And it's a presentation that's associated primarily with conduct. In terms of the Zen tradition, the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, we think of the provisional and the ultimate. So what samsara is there is not like the mundane world that we all experience, yeah, and that nirvana is heaven. We have the provisional is conventional reality. And we talk about these three things. I've mentioned them before, which is like these three kind of aspects, right? One is the thoroughly imputed, right? There's this thoroughly imputed aspect. There's other dependent, and there's ultimate. And what we do is, in the conventional world is, we have this kind of way that we relate to the world conceptually that is convenient, is necessary, but ultimately isn't true. And what is called nirvana in that context, or the ultimate in that context, is wisdom, realizing wisdom. Now, the important thing to understand is that these two things, like method and wisdom, are relative. Now, so to give you an example, you have to use a method in order to understand something, to develop wisdom. And let's go to a very simple example. If you go into preschool, then you learn the ABCs. So you've got this thing: A is for apple, B is for boy, C is for cat. This is methodology. It's a system of allowing someone to come to understand something. And then once that is understood or grasped, it becomes wisdom. So method becomes wisdom. But as soon as we've learned that alphabet then becomes, which is wisdom, right? The wisdom of knowing the alphabet, then becomes the new method for starting to learn the language. So first we have to understand the alphabet, then we use the alphabet to come to understand vocabulary. So we go, A is for apple, B is for boy, C is for cat, and then we go C-A-T, cat, right? So in this way, we use what was wisdom becomes method again. And by that method, then we understand vocabulary. And then we have to start understanding grammar. And eventually, we have a grasp of the language. And the extent to which we come to realize that language, to understand that language, differs. Some people become very skilled. Some people have just mere working knowledge, right? Some people only know enough of the language just to get by, to go to work. Some people become scholars. Some people become experts. And some people sort of, to the furthest extent possible in human culture, realize the depths of a particular language. And this kind of bar changes over time. So method becomes wisdom. Method becomes wisdom. The final and ultimate realization is where there is only wisdom, right? So it very much, in the Zen tradition, second turning the wheel, it's about transforming what is the conventionalities into wisdom and coming to realize primordial wisdom. Okay, so there's a difference there. In the lower schools or the foundational schools, it's about leaving the mundane world, keeping conduct, only keeping non-violence, meditating, and then you transcend into this conceptual nirvana. In the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, it's about transforming perspective and outlooks. Because you remember the Zen school, the Eastern tradition is what is called mind only, chittamatra, consciousness only. It's no longer about a real world that we need to escape. It's about having a different perspective, realizing, having a correct way of relating to reality. And that's the two truths. So the foundational vehicle is the four truths: theory of samsara, theory of nirvana, how to go from suffering into nirvana. The second turning of the wheel is about the two truths, the provisional and ultimate, method and wisdom. So using methods, we come to realize wisdom. And then when we realize wisdom, we are awakened. We realize our Buddha nature. And the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, that's when they start talking about the inseparability of samsara and nirvana. So in the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, what we're talking about is the one single truth. That there is only this ultimate wisdom, or it's actually, what it's taught is, there is only transcendence. There is nothing else. But through misconception, we perceive negativity. And so the Theravadan seeks to be liberated from the mundane world and achieve a state of nirvana. While in the Vajrayana, it's taught that the bodhisattva neither resides in samsara nor transcends to nirvana. They don't go for either of these extremes. And really what it's about is about this change in level of view, right? As I said before, the path is all about removing clinging. Clinging to what? Clinging to substantial reality. And in the foundational vehicles, they see the exterior material world to be made of real particles, real quantum particles, and mind to be made of real moments of consciousness. But these moments of consciousness, like particles themselves, are not useful. And everything that's composed of it, all composite phenomena, like my body and mind, psychosomatic kind of complex, is just like, we call a self, but is really just a collection of all these different particles. So it's like empty of self, it's empty of true nature, right? In their perspective. In the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, mind-only school, Zen tradition, they say external phenomena are not real. it is mind that is real, and mind projects the external world. So for them, they transform our conventional outlook into what they call wisdom. But in the Vajrayana, it's different. It's about merely recognizing things for the way they are. And that's the meaning of samsara and nirvana being not two. It's because, and these words come directly from the teachings on the Mahamudra, right? This ultimate view that we talk about. And the meaning of that is that this present moment of awareness is complete in awakening. But the reason why we don't see it is because we just have this naturally dualistic view. Now, I'm going to be careful with using the term dualism here, but I think this is the point that many people think about, right? Dualism and relativity. When we talk about pure, true non-duality, that's actually a much higher bar than most people think it is. For example, even people who are liberated from samsara, arhats, people who reach the path of insight, they don't realize, well, they don't actualize true non-duality until the 8th, 9th, and 10th level bodhisattvas. So it's actually a state very close to a tathagata. There's still some amount of duality. Anyway, the union of samsara and nirvana is not trying to make two things into one. It's that there is only this ultimate truth. There is nothing else. And that's kind of what we call the view in Dzogchen. And so I'll try to speed up a bit. And so she says, I also recall scratching my head with the Bible story of Adam and Eve eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. No one can give me a good explanation, so I surmise that this has something to do with conceptual knowledge. For example, I can conceptually understand infinity, but I don't experience infinity. Yeah, so this last section there is difficult. We can't actually conceptually understand infinity. We can't understand it, but we kind of conceptualize something that we say is infinity. But we experience infinity. So it's kind of the opposite. The problem is, from our perspective, we don't understand that. So what she's doing is making a correlation here between the story of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge and this presentation in the Buddha Dharma that says samsara and nirvana not two, based on the notion that these are about going beyond conceptuality and also going beyond duality. Okay, again, as I said, to actually go beyond duality is incredibly difficult. Now, there's different presentations when it comes to this notion of what we call, one moment please. Yeah, so what we call eating of the fruit of knowledge and what knowledge is. And so she correctly identified, I think, which most people, or most scholars say, is that this eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge is like relating to things in the terms of good and evil. Now, something we have to understand is that the term evil good, this is similar to the way the Tibetan language works, right? They've got pen nor. They have two words together means another word. And in Egyptian and in also ancient Aramaic, I believe, then this evil good actually means both good and evil, so it means everything. So it's the knowledge of everything. Now, a lot of modern people say that what they were teaching was non-duality. For us, what we need to understand is where this kind of story comes from and what it's about. Well, it's an esoteric teaching. And it's an esoteric teaching based on the Kabbalah. So this is the tree of life in the Kabbalah. And it has 10 or 11 what are called sephriotic fruit. So it's conceptualized like a tree that has like these different points on it that are seen as fruit. And these two up here, this Kokma and Bina, are respectively wisdom and intelligence. And I think many scholars relate to this story in terms of this Kabbalistic tree, and it's being codified into the Bible to be a story about Adam and Eve. And I think a lot of them agree that this means the point at which us humans develop free will. Now, this kind of knowledge isn't necessarily bad. The way we see it is like in the story, I think this is probably the way it's presented because the institutions at a latter date then wanted to stop people from thinking too much. They just wanted people to follow doctrine. But if you look at the Kabbalistic teachings, which is the foundation of, Christianity, etc., really when it comes to their theology and mysticism, then this wasn't necessarily bad. In fact, they say this triangular area between this wisdom and intelligence, right, is this darkness in here is where evil abides. But this evil isn't necessarily a bad thing. So many scholars interpret this to mean the point where human beings made the choice to distinguish between good and evil. So it sounds very much like it's about dualism. But you can also see the way that the Sephiriotic tree is laid out. It's about how things come into existence. For example, Keter is the emanation point. So for them, this point, or the word of God is Keter, is where from nothingness then there is the universe. And so it's like a systematic progression of existence. And we also present this in the Buddha Dharma. And part of that process is this development of wisdom and intelligence, which is able to discern between good and evil, and then you have free will. And maybe in some way this is essential in terms of Christianity and Judaism. It's like part of the process of coming into being. It's part of the process of coming to know God. And not like they disobeyed and they were really bad and so they got cast down. Although that's what it says in the story. But I mean, if you can look for yourself, right? You can look on the internet. There's lots of information about it. Some of it's incredibly academic. But I mean, the main point here is that the tree is actually talking about this, the tree of life that is from the Kabbalistic system. And then can we interpret this to be the same thing? Well, many people do. They say that they develop duality. And what they need to do is go back to non-duality. Well, we can say whatever we want. The truth is that these are incredibly deep topics. They're not in any way simple. And the presentation that's in the higher levels of Buddhist philosophy, so the Vajrayana, right, this one single truth I've spoken about in many previous videos, is not that easy to understand. They say that where we go wrong is we separate appearance and emptiness. So we have Samsara and Nirvana as being separate, or we have notions of good and evil. Also in the Vajrayana we talk about how there is ultimately no good or evil. So on the surface it can sound very similar. From our point of view, the importance is how our own personal view develops, and then how we are able to practice with that. And so remember, there's method and wisdom. There's the conventional side. Within that conventional side, there's all kinds of different methods. And these methods could be similar in my interpretation of Christianity or the Kabbalah, in my interpretation of Buddhism. That doesn't really matter. What matters is realization, and we need to develop realization. And actually that process itself is not straightforward. And it's not certain what will cause that to develop. So conceptually, we can use anything from any tradition and kind of mix it up a bit. And that could be useful for us. Where we have to be careful, as I said before, is when there's an internal conflict in our view. So if we interpret the Christian view to be that there is a theistic creator God who is responsible for everything in the universe, and in Buddhism it essentially teaches that this is a mistaken view, then there's going to be an internal conflict. But if we interpret God to be the ultimate meaning, the ultimate truth, like the Dharmakaya, you can give it whatever name you like, there's not a lot of difference between these two. So this is very important. She goes on to say, Shamatha meditation seems to strengthen my ability to stay in awareness. That's one of the entire points of Shamatha meditation, is to stabilize or prolong your awareness, strengthen your mental acuity. But this non-conceptual thinking is really difficult. Yes, it's very difficult. And Shamatha will not lead to that. Conduct will not lead to that. Study will not lead to that. But it will potentially prepare the ground so that one can make a leap-through moment. That leap-through moment, the intention of that leap-through moment is to develop this, what we call wisdom. And so, in terms of shamatha though, everybody needs to apply themselves to their shamatha practice. It's not like it can be put aside. We all need to do this in order to develop mental stability, because that's going to help us realize wisdom. And we mustn't be too impatient about developing wisdom. Like I say, it's not certain what will bring it about. For Tilopa, then he slapped Naropa in the face with a slipper, right? And in the Zen tradition, they give these koans to their students and they put them through trials. There's all different ways, methods, right? The methods aren't that important. What we have to do is we have to find the methods that are most suitable for ourselves. And the problem is that we don't generally know that. What we do is we look to find things that resonate with us. So ordinary sentient beings, as ordinary sentient beings, we're attracted to certain things. We have desire, we like this, like I like alcohol. And so then when we see a practice says, oh, you can use alcohol, you can use psilocybin to become spiritually awakened, we think, yeah, that sounds good. So what we do is we're attracted to that which resonates with us. But really, it's almost the opposite of what we want to do. Like, our teachers usually give us stuff we don't like, especially in the Tibetan tradition. If somebody has an aversion to something, the teacher will generally use that. Will say, oh, you need to do more of that. It's not 100% the case, but really what we need is help from somebody who can have a more objective perspective. And generally we don't recognize our own delusion. Pure Willpower from the US of A says, please tell what you know of Tao. Okay, so when I was young, then I studied the I Ching, and I was interested in Taoism. As you know, then there's this typical kind of geomantic diagram that you see in the Taoist tradition, and my father's Korean, and this is the Korean flag. And so I had a lot of interest in that, but that was many years ago. I don't know that much about Taoism. I've had some conversations with a Tao teacher in Nevada online. You can look at those. We've talked a little bit. But there's this general kind of principle that we call the yin and yang. And so many people see this as being, wow, that's the same as Buddhism, isn't it? Because like in Taoism as well, they talk about there being no creator God. So the idea is that there's this kind of thing called the way. Tao means the way, and it's like this natural state of the universe, this fundamental nature of the universe, which is this synthesis of these two forces, the dark and the light elements. And so basically what you need to do is remain in harmony with this natural way of the universe. And so they're very kind of attracted to, if you look at, let's look at sort of Tai Chi and that sort of thing, right? Qigong. Then this was based on, if you look at the early diagrams, it's like animals in nature, the way they act. So they've got this idea that nature is intended to be a particular way, and then you have to be in sync with that. So they imitate the motions of bears and deer and that sort of thing. And but although on the surface it sounds like there's a lot of similarities, then really fundamentally these are very different positions. Because in Buddhism we reject the notion of something like a nature of reality, like this fixed flow that you have to be in harmony with. What it says in the Buddha Dharma is that you create illusion through your actions. So it is by that we experience this dissonance in reality. And it's not that there is like some fixed plan or purpose or pattern or flow of the universe, right? So in the Tao, then we're talking about keeping these elements. You can see these little slashes on the sides, etc., keeping all of the elements in check. And then they also practice this sort of geomancy, which is like feng shui and things like that. So to organize things very much in the way that nature is organized. And for them, it really was about the nature that we see on the planet. Right? It wasn't about some cosmic nature. It was directly related to things like, tigers kill deer and this kind of thing, right? It was really about the environment that they could see, and that there was this fundamental permanent principle that was unborn, and that this is kind of like not a creator God, It wasn't created. It's an uncreated phenomena. It's permanent and unchanging. And then what you have to do is you have to stay natural within the environment. So if you look at the Chinese stories in the past, then they always have these accounts of the gods in heaven. And if you ever watched this program called Monkey, it's really funny, right? It seems to be kind of Buddhist-y, but there's a lot of Tao things in it. And then the gods are in heaven. They're saying, no, you mustn't act. Like inaction. Don't get involved. Let the universe flow the natural way it is. And of course, that's totally, opposite to Buddhism, really. This notion of inaction is not is not something that we do, right? We try to do stuff in order to get enlightened. And we also see that there is a kind of negative ignorance that we possess is something negative and needs to be gotten rid of. And so I think a lot of where people in the West see the Tao and Buddhism to be essentially the same thing is superficial because they both don't have a creator God, but also because when Buddhism came to China, it got really mixed up with Taoism, right? So there's like claims, like in Chinese they say, emptiness is the space between two mountains. And that's completely not compatible with the Buddhist view whatsoever. It's a Taoist kind of perspective. And so anyway, it got mixed up, and in this kind of sutras that they quote in Korea and China, then these sutras talk a lot about the Tao and things like that. So it's just a sign that it came and then it got merged with the Taoist religion. And so most of the kind of contradictory things that you see in Asian Buddhism come from this blending of these two religions, and that are essentially incompatible. But in terms of kind of original Buddhism or Buddhism, most other Buddhist traditions, then this perspective isn't there. Similar to how there's so much martial activity in Buddhism in China, it doesn't exist elsewhere. But the problem is now that the most Buddhists in the world live in China. And it happened quite suddenly because Mao Zedong tried to destroy religion, all religion, and he really oppressed the Buddhists, closed all the temples. And so that went on for, decades and decades. And of course there's this kind of spiritual void, right? This happens within any culture. If you try to destroy religion, it creates this spiritual void because people need spirituality, they need religion. Because there's these questions that, we can't answer, metaphysical questions. And that causes us sort of problems. We get internal conflicts for not being able to resolve these paradoxes. And science says it doesn't do this, but if you look at the way scientists talk, then they do exactly the same thing. They'll say no, like Carl Sagan. I love Carl Sagan. He was really influential when I was young, and he will say, well, religion is superstition, and you have to get rid of that. What you need to do is analyze phenomena. But then he talks about things like the significance or the importance of being aware of the universe you're in. And that's mystical thinking. That's spiritual thinking. It's totally non-scientific. In scientific terms, in a universe that is kind of causeless, it just randomly happened because of some big bang, then there's no special place for consciousness. It's just an emergent property, and we just kind of think we're special because we are aware of things, we can talk about it. In scientific terms, then you can't really talk about this special place for consciousness in the universe or preserving it, because it's like it will eventually just disappear, right? The universe will die, and then if there's other universes, it might or might not arise, but there's nothing special about it. But all these scientists talk about this significant, how important it is, this kind of, they talk in spiritual terms about our experience of the world, at the same time to say there is no spirituality, there is nothing special about things that we cannot directly perceive, which is totally contradictory. So anyway, it looks like we've come to the end of our time. Hopefully I got through a few more questions. I didn't go into much depth about this Taoist position, something I might talk about a little bit more. I mean, there are some various kind of characteristics associated with this and fundamental principles that they talk about. It can seem confusing and difficult to understand what the differences are, but once you do look into them with some more depth, you can see that although on the surface they sound compatible, that they essentially aren't. For example, we talk about this union of emptiness and appearance. It sounds like this dark and light of yin and yang, and they talk about this being in a synthesis. But the notion of this extreme of, for example, in Buddhism they say it's neither existent nor non-existent. It's not both existent and non-existent. But the Tao is talking about the synthesis of existence and non-existence, and so that's directly refuted in Buddha Dharma in all of its iterations. Okay, I better let you go. Thank you for joining us again. At the end, let's please just dedicate any merit, any virtue we've accumulated through this process for all beings throughout the various and countless universes, but also for those people suffering, are experiencing fear and trepidation, especially these times. Maybe we have to give some special wishes and prayers for those people dealing with uncertainty, living in Gaza, and who are in Ukraine, for example. These are troubling times, and things are changing quickly. And there isn't a lot we can do about that. It's the ripening of our karma. The important thing is that we don't lose our compassion, and that we don't fall into selfishness. Right? So most politicians these days, their justification for doing everything is based purely on selfishness. So what we need to do is we need to lose that, because selfishness, self-cherishing, is what is actually causing the trouble in the world. You know, it's not the guns and bombs, because they can't launch themselves. It's because we have self-concern, and then we want stuff, and we don't want to lose stuff, so we have enemies, etc. And so dedicate any merit that has arisen from our interaction to the benefit of all sentient beings. And until next time, see you later.